In May of 1989, a man appeared on a Las Vegas television broadcast with his face blurred and his voice altered, and he described, in calm technical language, 9 extraterrestrial spacecraft stored inside a classified underground facility in the Nevada desert. He was not shouting. He was not trembling. He spoke the way a mechanic describes a transmission problem, methodically, with technical specificity, without apparent concern for whether anyone believed him. The reporter sitting across from him was George Knapp, an investigative journalist at KLAS, the CBS affiliate in Las Vegas. The man gave his name as Dennis. That was all. No last name, no credentials, no documentation. Just a blurred face and a flat voice describing things that should not exist. 9 craft. Underground hangars. A classified facility south of the installation the government would not yet admit was real. The broadcast went out to a local audience in a mid-sized desert city, and almost nobody outside of Nevada noticed it at the time. That would change. What made the interview strange was not the claims themselves. UFO stories had been circulating in one form or another since the 1940s. What made it strange was the register. Dennis did not describe a sighting. He did not describe lights in the sky or a feeling of lost time. He described a work assignment. He described being hired, being transported to a location, being given access to specific hardware, and being tasked with figuring out how it operated. He described the propulsion system in terms that referenced physics. He described security protocols. He described the interior dimensions of the craft. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are recalling a job they used to have, not a vision they once experienced. That quality, the flat, procedural calm of it, is what separated this from everything that had come before. The tension at the center of the account is the same tension it has carried for 35 years. Either the man behind the blur had genuine access to extraterrestrial technology inside a classified government facility, or he constructed the most internally consistent and technically detailed fabrication in the history of UFO mythology. There is no middle position that fully accounts for everything he described. 6 months after the first broadcast, he returned to KLAS and appeared under his real name, Bob Lazar. He gave the facility a designation. He said it was built into the slope of a mountain above a dry lake bed in southern Nevada, roughly 12 miles south of the installation, known as Area 51, accessible only through blacked-out transport and controlled through security systems that did not yet exist in the public record. He called the facility S4, and what he said happened inside it is either the most significant disclosure in human history or the most successful hoax anyone has ever pulled. The facility Lazar described is not on any public map. It sits, according to his account, built directly into the slope of Papoose Mountain, at the edge of Papoose Lake in southern Nevada, 12 to 13 miles south of the main Groom Lake installation, not adjacent to Area 51, separate from it, a distinct facility with its own access protocols, its own security structure, and its own purpose, one that had nothing to do with conventional aircraft testing. Getting there was not simple. Lazar describes being flown out of Las Vegas on unmarked aircraft, what he called a Janet flight, a shuttle service that moved cleared personnel in and out of classified sites without any visible connection to the military. From the airstrip, passengers were transferred to buses. The windows on those buses were blacked out completely. You could not see where you were going. You could not track your route. By the time the bus stopped, you were inside a security perimeter, and you had no independent way of knowing exactly where that perimeter was. At the checkpoint, personnel were scanned using a handbone reader, not a fingerprint scanner, not a retinal scan, a device that mapped the internal bone structure of your hand. In 1989, biometric security of that kind was not part of any public conversation about access control. The technology Lazar described did not exist in any documented civilian or military application that had been disclosed. That detail has never been adequately explained by his critics. The hangars themselves were built into the mountainside. The doors were designed to blend with the surrounding rock face, angled and textured to match the slope. From the air, or from any ground position outside the perimeter, there was nothing visible. No structure, no entrance. The mountain looked like a mountain. Inside, according to Lazar, the hangars were large enough to house craft of significant size, and the facility was clean, maintained, and fully operational. Not an archive, not a storage site gathering dust, but an active program. Lazar says he was not prepared for what he saw when he first entered one of those hangars. He had no particular belief in extraterrestrial craft before this. He describes himself as someone who found the entire subject ridiculous, the kind of person who dismissed UFO reports without much consideration. When he saw the craft for the first time, his instinct was not wonder. It was something closer to professional recognition, the assumption that he was looking at an advanced American aerospace project, something developed in total secrecy, the kind of technology a government keeps hidden for decades before it ever becomes public. He says the first thing he noticed was the American flag painted on the side of the craft, and his first thought was that the United States had built something nobody was supposed to know about. Inside the hangars, Lazar says, there were 9 craft. Not 1, not 2. 9, in varying designs and varying states of repair, distributed across a series of bays that ran along the base of the mountain. He was not given access to all of them. His clearance covered a single craft, the one he was assigned to reverse engineer, and he describes the others only in passing, as shapes he could see from a distance on the occasions when hangar doors were open. What he could tell from those glimpses was that they were not identical. Different proportions, different configurations. Whatever program had collected them had not collected 9 copies of the same thing. The craft he worked on was a disc-shaped vehicle, roughly 9 meters in diameter. He called it the sport model, a name that was partly casual and partly descriptive, because it was the most intact and the cleanest of the group. The surface was metallic, similar in appearance to liquid titanium, and it was continuous. No seams, no bolts, no welds, no fasteners of any kind that he could identify. The entire exterior curved with the same radius throughout, and the sheen did not vary. It looked, he says, like the whole thing had been grown rather than assembled. Every surface transitioned into every other surface without interruption. If you have ever tried to imagine what a manufactured object would look like if the concept of joining 2 separate pieces simply did not exist in its construction, that is what he is describing. The interior is where the account becomes harder to explain. The space was small, cramped for a person his size. Lamps were brought in by the team for work purposes, standard halogen units, and they behaved incorrectly. They illuminated exactly where they were pointed. The beam landed where it was aimed, but the surrounding interior did not brighten the way it should have. Light did not scatter and fill the space the way it does in any room you have ever stood in. The interior stayed dark in a way that violated how light is supposed to behave. Lazar described it and moved on, as though he understood it made no sense and had no explanation to offer. Luigi Venditelli ran into this problem directly. While building a physical recreation of the sport model interior for his 2026 documentary, his set kept doing the same thing. The lights would not fill the space correctly. He could not get the interior to behave the way a normal room behaves. He did not treat this as a production inconvenience. He treated it as evidence, the kind of detail, he argues, that someone inventing a story would not think to include because it runs counter to every intuitive assumption about how enclosed spaces work. The controls and seating were sized for occupants considerably shorter than an adult human. The seats were not adjusted for human proportions. They were simply small. The seats were small enough that no adult human could have sat in them comfortably, which is either a fascinating detail or the most easily fabricated one in the entire account, depending on how generous you are feeling. The technical claim at the center of everything Lazar described is also the one that has proven the hardest to dismiss and the hardest to confirm. The propulsion system he describes does not resemble anything in the public scientific literature from 1989. It does not resemble much in the public literature today. What it resembles, in rough theoretical outline, is a set of ideas that physicists were not openly discussing until years after Lazar first went on television and described them to a local news reporter in Las Vegas. The fuel was an element he called Element 115. In 1989, that element did not exist on the periodic table. Lazar described it as a disc-shaped source material housed inside a reactor roughly the size of a basketball. When the disk was bombarded with protons, it underwent a nuclear transmutation. It converted into element 116. That conversion released antimatter. The antimatter annihilated on contact with normal matter and released energy. But the energy was not the point. What the reaction also produced, according to Lazar, was a gravitational wave. He called it a gravity A wave. That wave was then directed through 3 amplifiers positioned at the base of the craft in a triangular arrangement. The amplifiers focused it. And what a focused gravitational wave does, at sufficient intensity, is bend spacetime in the direction it is aimed. The craft did not thrust. It did not burn fuel in any conventional sense and push itself forward. What it did, according to Lazar's description, was distort the space in front of it and fall toward the distortion. The destination was not a point the craft traveled to. It was a point the craft pulled toward itself by warping the geometry between them, which means the craft and everything inside it were caught inside the same gravitational fold throughout the maneuver. There was no relative acceleration between the occupants and the vehicle, no G-force, no crushing pressure during the instantaneous direction changes that witnesses on the ground described when they watched test flights over the Nevada desert at night. If you are inside the fold, you feel nothing. A dog hears a whistle that the person standing next to it cannot detect. The craft moves in ways that should be fatal, and the physics inside it registers nothing unusual. This is where Lazar's account intersects with something harder to dismiss than his educational history or his personal record. In 1989, the idea of manipulating spacetime for propulsion was not in public circulation. The Alcubierre drive, the first serious theoretical framework for warp-style propulsion, was not published until 1994. Lazar was describing a functional version of the same basic concept 5 years before the physics community had even sketched it on paper. That could mean he was working backward from something real. It could also mean the idea was simply in the air in certain theoretical circles, and Lazar encountered it somewhere and built a story around it. Neither interpretation is provable. Then there is the element itself. In 1989, element 115 did not exist. The periodic table ended well short of it in terms of synthesized elements, and no laboratory on Earth had produced anything with 115 protons in its nucleus. Lazar said the stable isotope he worked with could not be synthesized on Earth with current technology. The equipment and conditions required simply did not exist here. He said the material had been provided. He did not say by whom. In 2003, Russian scientists synthesized it, named it moscovium, and watched it decay in milliseconds, which is either proof that Lazar invented the whole thing, or proof that what they built in a lab is not the same material he claims to have held in his hand. What Lazar describes about the briefing documents is the part of his account that receives the least attention, and it may be the most significant. The technical claims about element 115 and gravity amplifiers dominate most conversations about S4. But Lazar also says that when he arrived at the facility, before he was ever allowed near the craft, he was handed a set of classified documents and told to read them. Not to keep. To read in a controlled room under supervision as orientation material. The documents, he says, describe the history of contact between the visitors and the human species. Not recent contact, not post-war contact beginning with Roswell. Contact going back approximately 10,000 years. That number places the earliest events somewhere in the Neolithic period. There were no cities then, no writing, no civilization that modern historians credit with organized astronomical knowledge or complex religious systems. Whatever the documents described was happening before any of that. Lazar says the material covered specific contact events spread across both recorded and pre-recorded history, included descriptions of the beings involved, and made clear that the relationship between these visitors and the human species was not accidental and was not new. He is careful about exactly how much detail he offers, and he has been consistent about why. He did not have unlimited access to the documents. He read them once, under controlled conditions, and retained what he could. He was not permitted to ask questions about them afterward. The 10,000-year figure is the part that his critics find simplest to wave away. There is no document to examine, no page number to reference, no colleague who sat in the same room and read the same material. Everything Lazar says about the briefing documents exists entirely inside his own recollection of a single supervised reading session inside a facility that the government does not acknowledge. That is a reasonable thing to be skeptical about. It is also worth noting that the documents, if they existed in the form he describes, would represent something considerably larger than a propulsion system. A propulsion system is technology. A 10,000-year contact history is a different category of claim entirely. It changes not just what the government knows, but how long they have known it, and whether the relationship between the visitors and the human species has ever been what most people assume. He says the documents described extraterrestrial contact going back 10,000 years, and he was given them to read in a controlled room with no way to copy them and no way to take notes. The decision to go public was not, by Lazar's account, ideological. He was not trying to inform the public. He was not driven by some conviction that the world had a right to know. What he describes is something considerably more basic. He became afraid. The shift happened gradually. After he started asking questions at S4, about the boundaries of the program, about the classification structure, about what the standard exit process looked like for someone leaving this kind of work, the people around him changed. Security personnel who had been professionally neutral became hostile. He was pulled into what he describes as interrogation-style interviews focused not on his work, but on his personal life, his relationships, his activities outside the facility. Then he noticed he was being followed. Not occasionally, consistently. He says he recognized it as something other than routine protocol. The surveillance felt like escalation, like a closing of options. A man who is simply being let go does not get followed home. He concluded that his position at S4 had become unstable in a way that a resignation letter would not resolve. His response was to create witnesses. He began taking friends out to the desert on nights he knew test flights were scheduled, positioning them where they could see the craft moving. If other people had seen what he had seen, he could not simply be made to disappear without those people asking questions. It was insurance, not a press strategy. Insurance. One of those friends eventually contacted George Knapp, an investigative reporter at KLAS television in Las Vegas. That contact became the May 1989 broadcast. Lazar appeared with his face obscured and his voice altered, identified only as Dennis, and described 9 extraterrestrial craft stored in underground hangars in the Nevada desert. 6 months later, in November of the same year, he appeared again. This time, under his own name. This time on camera. What followed was not vindication. His educational records were not there. He claimed master's degrees from MIT and Caltech. Neither institution had any record of his enrollment. His connection to Los Alamos was real in some form. A 1982 phone directory placed him among the technical staff, but the role on record was contractor technician, not physicist. The gap between what he claimed and what could be documented was wide enough for his critics to build a permanent structure inside it. Then, in 1990, he was arrested for aiding and abetting a prostitution ring, pleaded guilty to felony pandering, and was ordered into psychotherapy. His critics did not have to work hard after that. The conviction handed them everything they needed to dismiss the rest of the account without engaging any of it directly. His company, United Nuclear, was raided in 2006 on charges related to shipping restricted chemicals across state lines. In 2017, the FBI and local police raided his workplace again, this time as part of a murder investigation in Michigan. He was not a suspect. That distinction rarely travels as far as the raid itself does. None of it made him recant. None of it produced an admission that the story was constructed or exaggerated, or invented for reasons that would now be obvious in retrospect. He has maintained the same account, in the same flat technical language, for more than 30 years. He has never behaved like someone who wanted to be famous for this, and he has also never fully escaped it. The most straightforward argument against Bob Lazar is not complicated. He says he holds master's degrees from MIT and Caltech. Neither institution has any record of him. Not an enrollment record, not a transcript, not a single professor who remembers him. Nothing. Stanton Friedman, the nuclear physicist who spent decades investigating UFO claims and who was not inclined toward easy dismissals, looked into the educational history and found something that is difficult to explain away. At the same period, Lazar was supposedly finishing a graduate physics degree at MIT. He was enrolled at Pierce Junior College in Los Angeles, roughly 2,500 miles from Cambridge. One of the professors he named as a Caltech reference was eventually located at Pierce Junior College, not Caltech, and had never held a position there. His high school record placed him in the bottom third of his graduating class. The only science course he completed was chemistry. Friedman's conclusion was direct. A student with that academic record would not have been admitted to either institution under any standard pathway. His employment at Los Alamos is real in some form. A 1982 internal phone directory confirms his name among the technical staff. But his role was contractor technician, not physicist. The distinction matters. A contractor technician at a weapons research facility is not the same as a credentialed physicist with clearance to reverse engineer propulsion systems from non-human craft. The gap between those two positions is not small. What the skeptics say this adds up to is a man who inflated his credentials at every level, possibly because the story he was telling required a kind of expertise he did not actually have, and that if the educational record is fabricated, the rest of the account should be evaluated with exactly that weight attached to it. You cannot separate the claim from the claimant. If the foundation is constructed, everything built on top of it becomes uncertain. Then comes the W-2 form. It is the only physical document Lazar has ever produced as evidence of his employment at S4. It lists his employer as the Department of Naval Intelligence. That agency does not officially exist. There is an Office of Naval Intelligence, which is a real and documented branch of the United States Navy. There is no Department of Naval Intelligence. Skeptics read this as straightforward proof that the document is fraudulent, that whoever created it either made a mistake or did not bother researching the correct agency name. Lazar's supporters read it the other way. A channel designed to employ people at programs that are not supposed to exist would not use the name of a real, searchable, publicly documented agency. It would use a name that points nowhere. It would be designed to fail a record search. Both of those interpretations fit the same piece of paper, and neither one can be ruled out with the information that is currently available. The only piece of physical evidence he has ever offered is a W-2 form naming an employer that officially does not exist, which either means the document is fabricated or means it is exactly what classified employment paperwork is supposed to look like. In 1989, when Lazar first went on television, Area 51 was an officially non-existent location. The government did not acknowledge it. The name itself was treated as the invention of people who believed things they had no business believing. When Lazar described it on camera, by name, with specific geographic coordinates, the default position of nearly every credentialed observer was that he was either lying or delusional. That default position has not aged well. In 2013, the CIA released declassified documents that placed Area 51 on official maps and confirmed the installation had existed and operated in secrecy for decades. The place Lazar described in 1989 as a real location is now a confirmed real location. That shift matters. It does not prove what was inside the facility. It does not validate anything Lazar said about 9 craft or element 115 or gravity amplifiers. What it does is remove one of the cleanest lines of dismissal. The argument that he invented a story around an imaginary base no longer works. The base was real. The secrecy was real. The federal government spent years invoking state secrets doctrine and presidential exemptions to shield information about Groom Lake from litigation. That is a documented fact. Then came the videos. In 2017 and 2020, the United States Navy released 3 declassified recordings of aerial objects performing maneuvers that have no conventional aeronautical explanation. No heat signature, no rotor wash, no tail fins, movement against the wind without deceleration, direction changes at speed that should not be physically possible for any object with mass. Jeremy Corbell, who directed an earlier documentary about Lazar, said that when Lazar was shown the gimbal video, he identified the propulsion behavior as consistent with what he had described at S4. A craft falling toward its destination by bending the space around it would behave exactly the way those objects behave on the recordings. That is not proof. It is a data point. Luigi Venditelli's 2026 documentary spent 4 years reconstructing the S4 facility in forensic detail. His team conducted terrain analysis on archival photographs of the Papoose mountain slope and says they identified geometric structures consistent with concealed hangar entrances exactly where Lazar described them. Venditelli came away convinced that Lazar's core account is genuine, while also believing Lazar is withholding certain information, possibly because of legal exposure he has never fully explained. Starting in 2023, Congress began holding UAP hearings in which military and intelligence officials testified under oath about retrieval programs. The conversation has shifted. It is no longer seriously centered on whether unexplained craft exist. It has moved to whether the government has them. None of what has happened in the last 30 years proves Bob Lazar worked on extraterrestrial spacecraft inside a mountain in Nevada. But the version of his story that was easiest to dismiss has not aged well.